Thank you. Thank you so much, Mara. Hi, everyone. Great to be with you all. I love seeing all of these introductions in the chat. Isn't it funny that it's winter? It's January. It's Shvat. It's the cold month in the Jewish calendar, and especially where I live in the northeastern United States. And it's literally our religion to think, what fruit do I like? I want to eat some fruit. Let's honor the fruit, and not just the fruit, but the trees. And we have all kinds of examples coming through in the chat. Thanks, everyone. So great to be with all of you. We are celebrating the birthday of trees. Tu Bishvat, the 15th of Shvat, starts tonight. And in this hour, we have a full hour, very exciting. We're going to look at some texts from the Torah, from the Mishnah, from the Talmud, as well as a few modern folks. And I really want us to think about this idea. And we're going to have two questions that we're going to keep coming back to. I'm going to put them in the chat. One question is, why do we need to know the age of a tree? Why do we need to know the age of the tree? And also kind of connected to that is, what is the age of a tree? Right? So is it when the seed went in the ground? Is it when, if you transplant a tree, is that on the day it gets transplanted? Does it get a different age? What is a tree age? So that's question number one. And question two is, as we learn about the ancient reasons for knowing the age of a tree, how might we apply that in modern times? And I want to be really careful when I say that the class here is not a class on Jewish law. My goal here is not to teach you exactly what to do. You're a farmer, you have an orchard, you're about to plant an orchard. The goal, we are going to be looking at Jewish law, and if some of the things we talk about apply to you and it feels, important to you, and you want to go further and consult a rabbi or a scholar of Jewish law, go for it. But we are going to be jumping around, kind of time traveling through different philosophers and legal writers, and also midrashists, mythical, creative understandings of this. And so I want to just say that for some people here in this Zoom, this does apply to you. You're like, I actually really do want to know what the original law says, because I am a halakhic Jew. I'm a Jew who cares about following the Torah law exactly, etc. And for some of us, this is metaphorical. And for some of us, we're somewhere in between. Maybe we have a few fruit trees, and there's a lot of different ways that we can be connecting to these. I just want to name, I can just looking at who's here. I know we have farmers, we have spiritual leaders, and we have just urban Jews who have no fruit trees on their land. And so I just want to name that we can all find ways to celebrate and honor the trees. And again, if you're coming from it at a legal standpoint, that is so great. I think that's super interesting. That's not going to be my primary mode. So I'm giving that as an introduction, because there are going to be a few times where you're going to hear me say things like, this is forbidden, or this is required. And in 99.999% of cases, when I say that in today's class, I'm really talking about according to the person who wrote the text that we're reading. I'm not telling anyone in this group what is forbidden or is required. Okay, amazing. Great to be with all of you. Here's how this class is going to work. We have a source sheet, and it's in a place called Sefaria. Many of you, especially if you studied with us before, have heard about it. So this is our source sheet. I'm going to be sharing my screen for most of the class, so you don't actually have to click on it, but I know some folks like to zoom in or just have a copy of it for the end. So that's in the chat, and you can use it, keep it, but you don't have to. I'm going to be sharing my screen for everything that we're reading. Another thing, which I think a bunch of you already figured out, is you can all type in the chat. You have a passing thought, you have a question, you want to comment or heart someone else's comment. We love the chat. There's almost 100 people here, and it's a really great way to keep the class going. It's almost like there's like the class on the screen, and then there's the chat. And so and the last thing I'll just say about the chat, some people find the chat really overwhelming, and they did not come here to chat with other students. They came here just to learn from the teacher. That's also fine. If the chat's overwhelming, just turn it off, ignore it, be with us in the Zoom room. But again, there's please write in the chat if you have a comment, a joke, a question. Please write in the chat. We will not be unmuting, but we will have lots of opportunities to write in the chat. So here we go. All right. All right, to Bishvat. So how do we get here? All right, we have a holiday, and it's to Bishvat. It's the 15th of Shvat. Where does that come from? Well, we are going to read some text about it. Let's see, my screen sharing is paused. That's interesting. Okay, let's try this again. Testing the screen sharing. Nope. All right, I'm going to try one more time, and then Mara, I might need to ask you to do the screen sharing because it's giving me an error.
No problem. I'm happy to. Oh, great.
Okay, there we go. All right, so it's just flipped for me. So I'm just going to move my camera. Actually, no, I can see. This works actually. I have two screens, so I want to make sure I can see you all. But that's good. That's cool. All right, let's do this. All right, great. You can have the chat over here. Love it. Okay, amazing. All right, so we are going all the way back to, we're going to start with the Mishnah, and then we'll go get to the Torah in a minute. So the Mishnah of Rosh Hashanah talks about what are the New Years. This funny thing where in Judaism, we don't just have one New Year, we have four. We have different New Years for different things. This is the very beginning of Mishnah Rosh Hashanah. There are 4 days in the year that serve as the New Year, each for a different purpose. The one that most of us are familiar with is Tishrei. We'll get to that in a minute. The first of Nisan, meaning the month that Passover is in, so springtime, is the New Year for kings. And the first of Nisan is also the New Year for the order of the festivals. It determines which is considered the first festival of the year and which is the last. Isn't that interesting that the time of year of blossoming and growth and coming back to life, that is one of our New Years? That's not for a few months. You can all wait for that. The first of Elul, so 1 month before what we call the Jewish New Year, the first of Elul is the New Year for animal tithes. And we sometimes just call it New Year for animals. Let's keep going. Some say that New Year for animals on the first of Tishrei. Okay, New Year on the first of Tishrei is the New Year for counting years, planting, sabbatical years, jubilee years, tithing vegetables. This is what we usually call the New Year. When we have Rosh Hashanah, that's in Tishrei. And then we get to our holiday. And here's what it says. The first of Shvat, the first of Shvat is the New Year for trees. The fruit of a tree that was formed prior to that date belongs to the previous tithe year and cannot be tithed together with the fruit that was formed after that date. This ruling is according to the statement of Beit Shammai, which is usually the minority opinion. But Beit Hillel say the New Year for trees is the 15th of Shvat. We're all here today. Today's the 14th of Shvat. Tomorrow will be the 15th of Shvat. If anyone here goes with Beit Shammai, maybe you already celebrated the New Year for trees 2 weeks ago. But here we are on the 15th of Shvat. As with most things in the Talmud, we go by Beit Hillel, and that ends up being the 15th of Shvat. So there are a bunch of different reasons why we need to know the name of the tree. And Mara, could you repost the link of the source sheet in the chat, please? Someone is asking for it. So there's a bunch of different reasons, but the one that I'm very interested in has to do with the concept of orlah. And we're going to be spending most of our time today learning about orlah. There'll be a couple other concepts that are adjacent, but we're going to mostly be talking about orlah. The age of the tree corresponds both to the first of Tishrei and the first of Shvat. But again, we're going back to our two big questions. How do we determine the age of a tree, and why do we need to know the age of the tree? So for that, we're going to go to the Torah. So here we go. We're back in Leviticus. And if anyone here is already giggling for hearing me say the word orlah, I think I've already said it at least 5 times, that's great. Giggling is welcome. The Hebrew word orlah is the same root as the Hebrew word milah, which is as in brit milah, as in circumcision, and it's essentially the same word. So we have orlah for humans, and we have orlah for trees, and they're the same word, and we're going to be seeing some comparisons as we go, and comparing and contrasting how those two concepts work. All right, here we are in Leviticus 19. When you enter the land and plant any tree for food, you shall regard the fruit as forbidden. And if we look at the Hebrew, it's a little bit clearer. If you notice that sometimes in Hebrew they repeat certain words. So ki tavohu el haaretz unitatem kol eitz ma'achel. So when you go into the land and you plant, you all, plural, plant any tree that is for eating, kol eitz ma'achel, va'arlatem orlato et pirio. You shall, then it repeats this word, or arlatem orlato et pirio. You should orlah the fruit. So what does this word mean? We're going to be talking about it a lot. 3 years, meaning the first 3 years of the tree's life, it meaning the fruit that grows on the tree, shall be forbidden. And this root that we're going to see over and over again, ayin resh lamed, it is commonly translated as to be uncircumcised, and that also corresponds to the word forbidden. Essentially, you are not to eat it. We're going to see a bunch of examples in other texts later that are saying that you cannot benefit from it. You can't make oil from it, etc. So we're already getting a question in the chat. When do the 3 years begin? Again, this is one of the big questions that we're going to try to figure out reading all of these texts today, right? Do the 3 years begin when the tree starts fruiting? Do the 3 years begin when you, take the seed and sprout it, but it's not in the ground yet? When do the 3 years begin? Very, very interesting question. And we already have an interesting question. Is this connected to the prohibition of cutting a child's hair in the first 3 years? We're already starting to have associations of this idea of like, you have this precious thing, and then for 3 years you leave it alone, and then after 3 years something else happens. So we're going to keep those questions. And yes, Nancy is making a really helpful comment. Is the repetition va'ar latem or lato? The Hebrew Bible does this a lot, where it says like, you will surely do this thing, like lech lecha, like go, right? There's a lot of examples of this in the Tanakh, and yes, it is, when you repeat it, it is for emphasis. You shall surely regard it as forbidden. So this is the really, really, really basic system. Of course, it's Leviticus. It doesn't give us every detail. That's why we have the Mishnah, etc. So in the first 3 years, the fruit is forbidden. We still have some questions about how that works. In the 4th year, all the fruit is set aside for jubilation, kodesh chilulim lashem, some sort of jubilation and celebration before Hashem. And only in the 5th year may you use its fruit, that its yield to you may be increased. So there's some sort of system where you have a tree, first 3 years, then the 4th year you have this something to do with jubilation, and then notice how the text here already starts talking about what the purpose is. Lehosif lechem tivuato. Why are we doing this? Because this is actually going to lead to an increased yield of the fruit. This holding back is going to lead to an increase. So we don't always do this, but there are times where looking at the Targum Onkelos, the Aramaic translation, gives us a clearer understanding of something that was written a long time ago. So let's look at the Targum Onkelos on just these 3 verses. So here's the English translation of the Aramaic translation of the passage we just read. When you enter the land and you will plant any food-bearing tree, you shall regard its fruit as closed off. And then those of us who can follow the Hebrew, uterachakun. So the word rechok is like you're going to have it like separated or far away from you. For 3 years it shall be closed off, and to you to be destroyed, it shall not be eaten. And so the idea here is merachak, it should be pushed away, le'avada, and then it should be destroyed. And a little spoiler alert that some people might know about, especially if you've done any farming in Israel, is that people who are in modern times observing orlah in a very strict way, they don't even use these fruits for compost. So because that would mean that you're benefiting. So in an orlah fruit in those first 3 years, you can't eat them, but you also can't like feed your animals with it or do anything with it. The idea is you're supposed to destroy it. We're going to see an example in a minute of what that is. We have a great question in the chat. Does this have anything to do with Shemitah? Kind of the opposite. Yeah, I mean, there's a number of biblical agricultural laws that talk about when you can plant, when you can harvest, what you can access. And interestingly, if we were talking about Shemitah, a big thing we would be talking about is the importance of relying on fruit from trees in a year that we're not planting. And so it does have to do with Shemitah in that in the ancient world, people relied on fruit from trees for a lot of what they were eating. There's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of discussion of, well, what happens in a Shemitah year, etc. But they're separate laws, but they have overlapping priorities, etc. All right, so just looking at the Onkelos again. So 3 years it shall be closed off, it was separated to you, to be destroyed. It shall not be eaten. On the 4th year, all of its fruit shall be holy, on which to say praises to Adonai. On the 5th year, you may eat its fruit, so it will increase its produce before you. I am Adonai, your God. All right, so we have this 4th year status and the 5th year status. So there's 3, then the 4th year, and then the 5th year. All right. We're going to read some commentary on this verse, and then we're going to get into some of the rabbinic texts as well. You're going to see very quickly that all of the texts that we're reading, the people who wrote them were reading all of the other texts. And so we're going to hopefully see some patterns and repetition, and that's actually going to help us understand it more. So here's our little verse. Va'araltem orlato et pirio. This meant literally, ye shall close its closing. Again, that's the repetition of that word. Regard it as enclosed. So you come over to your tree and it's, year 1, 2, or 3. And the average person might say, oh, look, my tree has fruit on it. But the Torah is saying you should regard it as closed. It's like locked. It's locked away. It's not available to you. Rashi writes, the meaning that it shall be, as it were, closed up and barred so that no benefit may be derived from it. And then we're going to, Stacey, I love that question. What does jubilation in the 4th year look like? We're going to see an example of that. Ibn Ezra, an even later commentator, also tries to understand this, va'arlatem et orlato, that the fruit is counted as foreskin. And he renders va'arlatem ve'orlato as you shall consider its fruit as foreskin. Orla means a foreskin. Hence, the interpretation, which is harmful and serves no purpose, such as foreskin of the lips, which is a passage we have in other places in the Bible, foreskin of the ear and foreskin of the penis. So there's a theme here where the same word for the fruit that you can't eat for the first 3 years is the same word as the thing that is harmful and serves no purpose. Again, this is Ibn Ezra's words. He continues. The meaning of the Ve'arel Tem, you shall count it, is considered as a foreskin. It is also beautifully explained in the Aramaic translation. You shall surely distance. So the arlatem et orlato, again, he loves the Aramaic translation. You shall distance yourself from this thing that you don't need. He emphasizes it shall be forbidden. So we have a really wide range of definitions for this word. Unto you, it shall be forbidden to you. All right, we're going to take a quick pause, and this is related to Stacy's question. What is this fourth year jubilation situation, which is called Neta Revai? It literally just means growth of the fourth year. This is not the focus of today's class because we're mostly going to be talking about orlah, but because we're talking about a holiday in modern times that's about eating fruit, and the original commandment is about, not eating fruit. We want to make sure we know what happens in between the not eating and the eating, and that is neta revai. So we're going to read this little passage, and something that's really fun about Sefaria is if you're passionate about this and you're curious about this, like Stacy's like, but I need to know more about the jubilation in the fourth year. You can just click on it, and then that's what Sefaria is, and you can go read so much more about it. And now that you have this really strange phrase, neta revai, you can go play with it. All right, here we go. So this is jumping way ahead to the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, because I just want to give you a summary of what this is, and then we're going to go back to talking about orlah. Okay, so B'shana HaRavi'it, so in the fourth year, so the fourth year of the tree. Again, I know we still have some questions about what makes the fourth year, how are we counting, when are we counting? And there's also going to be a lot of questions about planting indoors versus outdoors, planting in a pot, planting in the ground, planting in the land of Israel versus outside of the Israel. These will all be revealed in some form as soon as we can get to it. But people, thanks everyone. Thanks for your great questions, and please do keep posting in the chat. Here we go. The fruit of the fourth year's growth are called neta rivai, growth of the fourth year, and must be redeemed. Okay, so vits utsrichin pidyon. So they must be redeemed. That means exchange. Like when I have like a soda bottle left over and I exchange it for a nickel or whatever, I need to exchange it. Again, these are also forbidden, but in a different way. How does one redeem them? You pick them after they are fully ripe and take a silver coin or produce that is permitted to eat to the value of peruta. So you kind of hold the thing that you're not going to eat, and then you hold something of value that maybe is fruit you're going to eat, and you say, with this I redeem these fruits of the fourth year. You then take the coin or the produce, destroy it, and throw it into the river. So you take and throw it into a river. So you take the thing of value and you take this fruit that is forbidden to you and you throw them into the river. You do not recite a bracha, you do not recite a blessing on the redemption of neta revai that grew outside of Eretz Israel. Again, this is implying that people do observe this outside of the land. Okay, so this is what neta revai is. And the idea is that probably in ancient times there was also it was like a joyful thing. Maybe it's because you're finally in the fourth year and you're going to get to eat your fruit. And we have a question. There are male human parallels here. Which was first? Does the fruit orlah follow the human or the other way around? Yes, all of this will be available. We can put the link in the chat, and this will be all on the YouTube page of My Jewish Learning. All good, all good. All right, so let's go all the way to the Mishnah, and we're going to keep going. We had another question, is this Bikurim? There's so many great questions here about other ways that this law intersects or doesn't intersect with other biblical based agricultural laws. Bikurim is also an important one that has to do with the first fruits of that particular year. We're not going to talk about Bikurim today. It is separate from Bikurim, but like everything, it's interconnected with Bikurim. And we are not going to get into Bikurim today, but I would love to do a session on Bikurim another time, and maybe we'll email you all about a new session, Mara, for Shavuot. All right, so here we go. So Mishnah Orlah. Whoa, there's an entire Mishnah on this concept. That must be important. All right, so here we go. This is one of my favorite lines. I think it could just be a song because I just think it's hilarious. I'm going to read the Hebrew, and then we're going to read it together. So this is how the Mishnah Orlah opens. Hanotea lisayag ul korot patur min ha-orlah. One who plants a fruit tree as a fence or to provide wood beams is exempt from the law of orlah. I just think this is hilarious. Like, I think we could just spend the rest of the class just laughing about this line, because this is like they're like, okay, got to say the most important thing first. Okay, got to make it super clear how this law works. Okay, if you happen to plant a fruit tree but you're planting it as a fence, or you're planting this fruit tree to provide wood beams, you don't have to follow the laws of orlah. I just love that that's the opening line. I think it's hilarious. Hanotea lisayag. Like, that is just, I just think that is hilarious. Then you don't have to follow orlah, because in its essence, it's not a fruit tree, it's a fence. And then you don't have to do it. Rabbi Yossi adds, even if he said the inward facing part of the tree is for food and the outward facing part is for a fence, the inward is subject to orlah and the outward is exempt. And I'm just imagining these rabbis with their trees, and they're like, okay, the tree is a fence, and then they're like walking, and then they're like, I don't know if you can all see, I'm just like laughing really hard. I'm just like, woo, okay, this is hilarious. Okay. All right, now we get to another number 2. I think is actually much more relevant to some of our existing questions and how we think about the age of the tree. If at a time when our ancestors came to the land and they found a tree already planted, it was exempt. So there's this very, very common thing, which is like, well, what if you don't know the age of a tree? What if you just bought a house or bought a farm and you don't know how old a tree is? If you didn't plant it, that's, again, another loophole. You can be exempt. If they planted a tree, even though they had not conquered the land, it was subject to orlah. Really trying to figure out exactly what this means here. Like, you like snuck onto someone's land and planted a tree and then you captured the land. Not totally sure what that means. I still think it's hilarious that possible situation is here. If one planted a tree for the use of the many, it is subject. So if we have a common space, like in the center of town, maybe a shared orchard or a public area, and you plant this tree imagining that it's going to, anyone can come and have some. I live in Park Slope, Brooklyn, and there are some fruit trees on the street that people are just aware of, that they can go and enjoy the fruit from. If one planted the tree for the use of the many, it is subject. So if you have in mind that based on where you're planting the tree, that other people are going to be eating the fruit, you have to follow the laws of orlah. And then Rabbi Judah makes it exempt. So not everyone agrees. So there's something about public versus private. If one has planted a tree in the public domain, or a non-Jew has planted it, or if a robber has planted it, or if you plant on a boat, hanotena bisfina, okay, all you planting trees on boats, I see you, trying to avoid these laws. Or plants a tree on a boat or a tree that has grown on itself, it is subject to orlah. So some of these are going to be contradicted later and disagreed with, but the original Mishnah here is that even if it's planted in public, even if a non-Jew has planted it, or any of these other situations, it is subject to orlah. Yeah, exactly, Nora. Your boat garden, you have to observe orlah. You thought you were going to avoid it by planting on a boat, but but you got to follow orlah those first 3 years. And again, I'm noticing, based, just in the chat, but also I'm curious what people think, how many people see this law of orlah. Let's just pause for a second. I'm going to pause the screen share just for a minute. I want to take a little, can we do a poll in here? Maybe we'll take an informal poll. I want to get a sense from the room. Again, especially, we have a really diverse group. People live all over the world. Some people here have planted trees before. Some people are urban folks. Some people, maybe their families planted trees or they've been to an orchard, but they're not like actively involved. I know we have a bunch of Jewish farmers here. It's really great to see you all. I want to get people's just instinct on this, because clearly the rabbis are like trying to help people follow the Torah, and they really, really care about that. But they're noticing that there's some of these, boat garden people, we'll just call them Nora and their boat garden, these boat garden people who are thinking, I know how I'm going to get around this law. I'm going to plant it on a boat. So first of all, let's just kind of state the obvious. Why would someone be trying to get around this law? Why does someone think that, let's hear a few thoughts in the chat. Why does someone think, well, this is a silly law? Maybe
I can create a poll if you want me to.
Okay, great. Oh, let's do a poll. Okay. So the poll should say, do you think, your instinct, what does your instinct say? Is orlah something that we should be striving to keep? Or does orlah kind of feel like a restriction that we shouldn't be striving to keep? Just an instinct. I know it's much more nuanced on that, but I'd be interested to just do a quick poll from the group. Based on, if you planted a tree tomorrow and then someone said you have to keep orlah, is your instinct like, oh yeah, let's try this? Or is your instinct like, oh, this feels like a restriction? So we'll just do a quick poll, and we're getting some great comments in the chat, including I can see from some of our farmers here. Yeah, some of us are impatient. Some of us are hungry. Again, this is our instinct. This is not a scientific poll. Super curious, just what's the kind of temperature in the room. We have someone just, Nancy, we should keep orlah. Nancy from Toronto, thank you. Putting in resources for 4 to 5 years before you can make money may encourage people to focus on annuals. This could be a financial hardship, right? It actually could, those of us who are saying, oh, it's more sustainable to grow perennials, trees, they bear fruit, but 4 or 5 years, that's a really, really long time. It could be a financial hardship. Shamu writes, keep it. It's good for trees and long-term sustainability. Some people are saying, wait, long-term benefit returns short-term returns. All right. People want to know what the fruit tastes like, right? How many of us in the past week were making a little soup, and to taste it as it's going? How's it doing, right? What, 5 years? Can you imagine? Think of, it's 2024, what you were doing in 2019, and you have something, doesn't even matter what it is. It's a tree, it's something you're thinking about. I don't even live in the same apartment I lived in 2019. Everything's totally different. 5 years is a long time. Human and nature try to circumvent the rules, right? It's human nature to say, how do I get around this? Plant it on a boat. We have a lot of people saying, let's keep it. Hannah writes, I'd be open to trying it until I get impatient and impulse wins. That's what Yom Kippur is for, but I would try. Many variables. It can seem wasteful. Yeah, thank you for saying that, Simone. It seems wasteful, at least say, oh, this is a spiritual practice, but let's use it to feed our animals. What's with the throwing the fruit in the river? It's very strange. Okay, cycling the soil isn't always a waste. Cycling into the soil. Yeah, Jack, totally hear you, Jack, one of our farmers here. And yet, interestingly, it starts getting super strict. So even if I were to cycle it into the soil, there are some rabbis who would say, and I'm not saying this, you can't even use it for compost. So strange. All right. Stacy adds, practice restraint, putting off gratification. This is good for our consciousness development, right? We could have Stacy over here and then someone else saying, yeah, but I'm hungry. Yeah, I need to sell my produce. It's a great concept in theory. Lee adds, lack of trust in Hashem might discourage orlah. There's a lot of bitachon, there's a lot of faith in this. We have Stacy writes, allowing development of other species before extracting from them. May writes, would farmers be reading this when it was written? Is this a literal guide for farming or more about the rituals around it? I love that question. There's a lot we don't know historically about how strictly people kept these laws. I think it's hilarious to imagining these rabbis sitting around in like the yeshiva and talking about these kind of theoretical situations. Suzanne is reflecting on the squirrels who are munching on their fruit trees. It's a sacrifice. Shamu says, can we not throw coins and fruit in the river? All right, we have some great comments here. All right, officially 80% of this Zoom says we should keep it. We can do another survey another time, maybe thinking about how many of those people actually rely on fruit trees for food. And I think there is this bigger thing where at what point does it, something that is a spiritual practice with your relationship to the land, at what point does that turn into something so impractical that you just give it all up, versus at what point do you do it enough times that it's so meaningful that it kind of goes into other spiritual practices? So similar to how some of us have talked about Shemitah, if I had to wake up tomorrow and live off the land without planting anything new, it'd be really challenging. But if over the next 30 years, I needed to set up a system where every 7 years I didn't plant for a whole year, well, what would that do to the rhythm of my life? And I think it's similar to the fruit trees, which is how are we in relationship with these trees? And I think we're going to jump back into the text, and I think we're going to see some really, really, really special examples of how the rabbis and how other commentators viewed the trees and the trees as their own being. And that this has to do also with a level of respect and honor for the trees themselves and the trees' relationship to the land. So let's go back to the trees. When we did that poll, and I know it was very, very unscientific, the idea here is, we could have had another layer to the poll, which is like, are you currently growing any trees? Does any of your livelihood have anything to do with selling trees? Will your family have enough food to eat this year if your trees on your land don't bear fruit? Most of us in 2024, even if we live on a farm, we can still go to the store. We can get government support for food. In ancient times, it was not always exactly like that. And so we have to also keep in mind that when a lot of these texts were written, the question of Yom Kippur, who will live and who will die in the next year, has to do with how much produce everything is producing. All right, we're going back to our source sheet, and let's look at this next text. We're not going to spend too much time talking about this. There's some really, really helpful essays out there. And again, I don't agree with all of the modern interpretations of this, and I'm not here to tell you what to do as a Jewish people who do or do not follow Jewish law. But I wanted to include that in the later, different Mishnah Kedushin, it says the following. Any mitzvah that is dependent on the land, aretz, it's tiluya ba'aretz. This is a very common phrase that we have throughout rabbinic works saying, well, does it apply only in the land of Israel, or does it apply outside of the land of Israel? Any mitzvah, any commandment in the Torah that is dependent on the land, aretz, applies only in Eretz Yisrael. So if there's a commandment in the Torah that says da 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 when you enter the land, then that has to do with trees and land and rocks and whatever that's in the land of Israel. And any mitzvah that is not dependent on the land applies both in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael. And again, this phrase, tiluya ba'aretz, even though it might seem vague, va'aretz, that phrase, even though it literally means in the land, it means the land of Israel. This is apart from the mitzvot of orlah and kilayim, which apply even outside of Eretz Yisrael. So orlah is in this category that says that even though it is tuluya ba'aretz, you actually are supposed to keep orlah outside of the land of Israel. So again, if we were doing a whole course on biblical agricultural laws, we would spend some time on kilayim, we would spend some time on Shemitah, and we would see that most of these ancient biblical agricultural laws are really only applicable in the land of Israel. And this ends up being very funny in the modern state of Israel, because the modern state of Israel borders are not the same as the borders of the Bible. And so we have this funny thing where they're like, no, if you're farming in a lot, that's actually outside of the land, etc. So we're not going to get too far into this, but for those who, especially those who are farmers and who are curious about keeping these laws in modern times, if you're going to pick just one to try on, then orlah and kilayim are the ones that are actually, according to the Mishnah, applicable outside of the land. We had someone mention orange trees can take 20 years to bear fruit. Yeah, that's going to help. And then someone adds, this is the easiest way to follow the laws. Just plant orange trees. I would love an orange tree here in Brooklyn. That would be amazing. I ate so many oranges. Felix writes, I wonder how orlah applies in the common practice of grafting. We're going to see some examples of that. And if we don't get to all of the text in our source sheet, there's a bunch of links that have to do with grafting. The rabbis really knew about that. And I'll just add, Felix asks, what about a tree of an unknown age? Can we estimate? So the short answer is, we can assume, basically, if we go back to the original passage in the Torah, that we can estimate, and we can just assume that it's already more than 4 years, and we don't have to practice orlah. So that's kind of like an interesting situation. Carol adds, my neighbor has a 20-year-old apple trees and lets me have some for my apple challah in the fall. Sally adds, now not only do I need to ask, is this fruit organic, but I also need to ask, did you observe orlah when growing this fruit? Can you imagine the looks at Whole Foods or at your local natural food store? I love this question. And as someone who lived in Jerusalem and had a CSA box in 2015, which was also a Shemitah year, this is absolutely the case, that there are categories of kashrut within the modern state of Israel that also include some of these laws, and there are people who will or will not eat certain vegetables based on if that farm observes orlah, Shemitah, and many of these other things. Hannah adds, when in doubt, pikuach nefesh, and I'm going to heart that, because yeah, I think for me, a lot of these are symbolic, and I was just giving a class yesterday about a burial, and there are examples of things in the Bible that are really fascinating, and we're like, let's see how we can take that on. That's so interesting. And there are things that are in the Bible that the Torah is telling us to do that are really disturbing, and we should not try to take them on. All right, so let's keep going. Let's look at a few more texts together. If you can believe it, it's already 47 past the hour. Let's look at some, let's see. Let's look at some midrash. All right. Midrash Tanchuma. The orlah tree, says the midrash, can be compared to an infant. So we had some folks asking about human comparison. A young tree until its third year is called orlah, which translates as blocked. So too, a child is blocked until the age of 3 from communicating, since typically children do not develop proper language until around the age of 3. Of course, we could have another entire conversation about what is communication, and is language the only form of communication? There's other forms of communication, but Midrash Tanchuma, we'll keep going. The 4th year of a child's life is the first year where he or she or they can use language to express themselves. Like a 4th year of the tree, this is the first year of dialogue between parent and child, is kadosh, holy, and should consist primarily of Torah topics. Just like in a tree's 5th year, the farmer can begin to benefit from the tree's produce without limit. So too at age 5, the Midrash instructs that a parent should begin to teach the child to read from the Torah and eventually the Mishnah, the oral law. So yeah, so I think there's a lot of parallels. We're comparing the tree to a child, and we're also talking about communication, which I feel very excited about. There's another midrash based on our original passage that says, talking about impatience, and talking about Adam Harishon, Adam in the Genesis story. Rabbi Yehuda ben Pazi taught, who will wipe the dust from Adam Harishon's eyes to see that although you couldn't obey your commandment for one moment, meaning the do not eat the fruit, so the fruit in the Garden of Eden, your sons wait the orlah for 3 years. So this idea being that maybe there's a connection between Adam's impatience and our now needing to be patient for 3 years. Maybe orlah is actually a punishment for Adam being impatient, or the opposite. Adam should think of himself as think of his descendants as making a tikkun, as making a healing for his impatience, and now we have to be patient. We mentioned this earlier. Oral applies everywhere, for all trees, and this idea that it's more strict in the land of Israel. Let's see. We have 10 minutes left, and we're getting so many great comments in the chat, so I want to make sure we get to respond to them. Let's see. We're gonna go to, okay, I'm just gonna pause for a second. Yeah, so Ki Adam Eitz HaSadeh, we have this line in the Torah that says, the humans isn't a human a tree of the field? Exactly. And I think there's a lot of parallels. I don't have a reference for a direct link between the idea of not cutting a child's hair for 3 years and not eating the fruit for 3 years. I'm sure people have written about it. I don't have a specific answer to that. Janet writes, is this comment on the possibility of evolutionary spiritual emotional growth? We learn through the mistakes and are hopeful that each generation will do better. Francis says, during the Depression in the 30s, many just had apples to eat. Yeah. So I want to come back to this idea about planting a tree in a pot and versus in the ground, because I am very inspired by some of the writing about this prohibition, because it starts the commentators give us some of the perspective from the tree itself. Okay, so I'm going to go kind of quick, but I promise you all have this sheet to read through later. This is in the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides. So the restriction of neta reva'i applies to all plants, which the prohibition of orlah implies. We saw this before. This is summarizing a lot of the other texts, so this is why this one's helpful. When a person plants a fruit tree with the intent it serves as a hedge, it's exempt. So we talked about this before. The inner side versus the outer side. I'm going to keep going. Jumping to number 4. When a person plants trees for the sake of the people at large in his own field, orlah applies. When a person plants tree in the public domain, or on a ship, I'm kind of jumping to the non-italic words. When trees grow on their own accord in a private domain, and then it jumps to these laws apply. Then it jumps to trees that grow on their own in rocky terrain. So this could be like in a forest or something like that. Then we start having exemptions. So if a tree is like growing in the wild, again, I'm jumping to the non-italic. Even one who plants trees in an unsettled place is exempt, provided the tree does not produce enough fruit so that it would be worthwhile for a person to care for its produce until he brings it into settled land. If, however, the tree produces enough that it is worthwhile to maintain it, the prohibition of orlah applies to it. So the prohibition of orlah is directly corresponding to how many people are benefiting from the tree. If it's way up a mountain, it's an area where people hardly ever go, you can have as much of the fruit as you want. Again, it's like a wild tree. But if whether you planted it yourself or not, so orlah has to do with the people's consumption of the fruit. Okay, really want to just look at the flower pot, and keep asking your questions in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can in our last 7 minutes. When a person plants a tree in a flower pot, and one commentator says whether of wood or earthenware, without a hole, so a non-perforated flower pot, the prohibition of orlah applies. Again, I'm looking at you, all of you boat garden people. Although planting in such a pot is not considered planting in the earth with regard to smaller plants, so meaning basically non-trees, and there's a bunch of other laws, like in terms of Shemitah, that we want to know if that planting is considered in the earth, if it's in a pot. It is considered planting in the earth with regard to trees. And there's a few different ways to read this, but I'm reading it as the tree experiences it as if it's being planted in the earth, even though it's being planted in a pot. And so there's this idea that if the pot doesn't have a hole, so it's a solid pot, and the planting of the tree from the perspective of the tree is like, it's a huge pot, and as far as the tree is concerned, the tree is planted in the earth. It's full of soil, there's rocks around, there's other things happening there. And from the perspective of the tree, I know that's not exactly what's written here. It says with regard to trees, but the way I read it is like from the tree's perspective, the tree feels like it's planted in the earth, and therefore orlah applies. It even goes so far as to say when a tree is planted in a house, orlah applies. Trees planted by Gentiles before our ancestors entered the Holy Land were exempt. So this is the question before, what if you don't know how old a tree is? You got there and you're like, I don't know. You can kind of just assume that it's exempt. Then there's a bunch of stuff about grafting and transplanting that we're not going to get into, but now you all have it forever. We'll look at our last couple texts super quickly, and then I'll go to the chat. So this is a 1600s passage, and this is reminding us that in many commentaries say with regard to the essence of this mitzvah, it is based on the Amorite law to create tricks, shortcuts in order to hasten the ripening of the fruit of the tree before its time. Tricks and shortcuts. Maimonides wrote that this mitzvah is to remember the creation of the world, since everything was created on day one. Again, this is a philosophical writing more than a legal writing. Everything, individual categories emerged each on its own day. Plants were hid in the ground until day 3, and even though they bloomed on day 3, they aren't even seen till day 4, and the lights of the sky cause the fruits to ripen, because all the ripening is dependent on the sun and the moon, with the bounteous yield of the sun, all the bounteous crop of the moons. So we find that they were hidden, impossible to eat, until day 4. So this is the not eating for the first 3 years corresponds to the first 3 days of creation. Based on this, we are instructed to keep the mitzvah of orlah in memory of the creation of the world. And this is quoted many times all over the place. Our plants too should be hidden and sealed for 3 years, since the essence of orlah is being hidden and sealed. And this is actually just from a conversation I had with Dr. John Greenberg, amazing scholar of Jewish botany, has a new Haggadah out. You should all check it out. I think he sometimes teaches for Midrash Learning. Both orlah and circumcision are examples of the idea of humanity partnering with God in completing the work of creation. And he's commenting on this passage here. My final question, which I leave you with, is how do we reconcile? I think this is fascinating to me. How do we reconcile the mitzvah of orlah being about not eating fruit, and the minhag, at least in 2024, of Tu Bishvat being about eating fruit? And I've been asking this, and I've gotten lots of different answers, but my favorite one, of course, was my teacher, Rabbi Yisachar Katz, quoting the Talmud, And he quotes this line, which is, and if you want to click on it and see the whole passage, it's fascinating, because he's quoting Yalta, so as a woman or a wife of a rabbi. And she says, as a rule, for any item that the merciful one prohibited to us, he permitted to us in a similar item. And so this line, that everything that is prohibited in one way is permitted in another way. And so I love this idea of aligning it, of saying, well, it's prohibited in these times and it's allowed in these times. Folks who want to know about how we determine the age of the tree, we did skip a few texts, and there's a lot of different opinions on it in terms of when and how it was planted or if it was grafted. So I hope you'll go back and check those out. And happy Tu B'Shvat, everyone. It was really wonderful and really fun to play with you in all of these texts. And I'll pass it back to Mara to close this out.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I'm seeing in the chat that people are hungry for more than an hour of learning. We send out the recording, we send out the source sheet, and we also send out a survey. So please feel free to include in that survey what you would love to learn, either more with Kohenet Sarah or generally. And if you don't feel like you've had enough of your Tu B'Shvat rituals or learning done, I'm adding into the chat, and I will also include this in the follow-up email. We're having a Tu B'Shvat Seder this evening. So we'd love to see you there. And as Sarah said, thank you so much, and happy Tu B'Shvat.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.